community on this territory. Before we get started, I want to make sure to start by making sure everyone knows how to participate fully. You will see the slides and you will hear the presenters speak. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment to the presenters, simply type your message at the right side of your screen and click send. As moderator, I will be monitoring the chat and we will do our best to ensure that all of your questions are answered. There will be time to address questions and answers after the presentation. Before we get started, I would like to recognize partners, the Royal Ontario Museum and the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, as well as the Ontario Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration for funding the Museum Inclusive Leadership Project. As part of this project, I'd like to mention the Inclusive Museum Guide that we'll be launching at the Inclusive Museum Leadership Symposium on March 23rd, 2018 at the Ontario Science Centre. Toolkit is being developed by 10 partner museums from across the province with feedback drawn from the experience of experts and innovators on our project advisory committee, as well as from within their communities. Many of these project participants are joining us here today, as well as some from the wider OMA membership. I'd like to take this opportunity to extend a warm welcome to all. The topic of this webinar is Managing Up, Down, and Across Change Management Fundamentals, and is an opportunity to learn about how each of us can create a cultural shift towards equity and inclusion in the Ontario Museum sector. At this point, I would like to introduce Ontario Museum Association Councillor Sonia Merva, who will deliver our welcome and opening remarks.
So good afternoon, everyone. As a councillor at the Ontario Museum Association and an advocate in the Museum Inclusive Leadership Project, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this fourth webinar as part of our ongoing work to support a strong and vital and inclusive museum sector in Ontario. The diversity and inclusion initiatives of the Ontario Museum Association and its partners, the Royal Ontario Museum and the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, continue to be informed by Ontario's Museum 2025 Strategic Vision and Action Plan, which provides a direction for the future of our museum sector and are strongly aligned with the Ontario's culture strategy. In light of Ontario's museum's request for increased operating funding in 2018, as part of CMOG and the recent McDonald's ad campaign, we can see that public support for the value of museums is key. To be responsive, change is needed. Together, the OMA and its partners have been working on an initiative to ensure museums remain relevant as institutions, contributing to stronger societies and to a stronger sense of well-being and belonging for Ontario's diverse communities. In particular, this initiative seeks to address the need to embed key principles of diversity and inclusion into different areas of museum practice and foster a culture of inclusive leadership. The discussion today will focus on individual and organizational strategies to create a cultural shift towards greater equity and inclusion. Whether you are an emerging museum professional, mid-career, or senior leader, today's webinar will help us to understand how to approach change as a process to support individuals and institutions in embracing new approaches. No matter what level or stage you are at today, today's discussion will help you take the first steps in understanding how to introduce change so that Ontario museums can become more inclusive and equitable in their practices. Thank you for joining us and setting aside this time to consider how we can work collectively to become a more diverse and inclusive sector that is stronger, more relevant, and more reflective and welcoming of all of Ontario's communities. Now, to guide our conversation, as we consider approaches to introducing change in the sector, we are very fortunate to have our presenter with us today. Cathy Gallagher-Louisy is Senior Director, Consulting for the Canadian Centre of Diversity and Inclusion. She leads CCDI's Cultural Competence Consulting portfolio and provides a range of leadership development, strategy development, and change management consulting and training services within public and private sector organizations and academic institutions. Welcome you, Cathy, and thank you for joining us today. Present. We'll have some time for questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to join. I appreciate being here. I just want to confirm that you can hear me.
We can hear you, Cathy. You're good.
And thank you very much. Sometimes when you're on a webinar, it feels like you're talking to a black hole, so thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to be talking today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, as well as it's not the first time that I've spoken to folks in the museum sector, and I wanted to state right up front that I am so delighted to be involved in this project. I love museums. It is part of what I do, and art galleries. When I travel, I go to museums and art galleries in the city that I'm going to. My family has had family memberships in many museums in the Toronto area and art galleries as well, and so I'm delighted to be a part of this. So let me get right into my slides here. So a bit about me. Yes, I am the Senior Director of Consulting at CCDI, which means that I'm leading our client services that we provide to companies and organizations. CCDI is a national charity. We provide events around diversity and inclusion in 18 cities across Canada. Our consulting business is a for-profit social enterprise that's owned by the charity that feeds its revenue back into the charity and supports our charitable functions. I use she and her pronouns. I would also like to thank the OMA and the ROM and all the champions and advocates on this particular project, as well as the MCI for funding the project. There's a lot of people contributing to this project, and it's really important that there be a lot of people contributing, and that's the best way to make it successful. The other thing I'd like to do for a moment, if I can, is to mention that we are trying to conduct a census of museum employees across Ontario, and it's really important that we get people to opt in to the census. Right now, we do not have a critical mass enough of museum employees who have opted in for the census, and it's really important that we get a good response rate. Otherwise, the data won't actually be representative of your organizations. So if you're sitting in a museum in Ontario and you've been asked to opt in and haven't already, please do so. If you're in a position to influence and encourage other people in your museum to participate in this, it's really vitally important that we get a good response in order for the data to be useful. So really do hope that you'll consider promoting that. If you're on social media, our social media accounts are there. I have a ridiculously long last name, but a short Twitter handle, @CatGL, if you want to tweet along with us. And @CCDI Tweets is the CCDI Twitter handle, and the hashtag Canadian Diversity, CDN Diversity, is a great place to go and learn about diversity news and information that's happening every day. We're tweeting there with that hashtag every day, and it's Canadian-specific information. A bit of agenda today. I want to talk about how advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion is change, and that's why we really need to understand taking change management approaches. I'm going to do a quick, just very quick review of a toolkit that we put out a few years ago that was called Addressing Fear and Resistance to Diversity in Organizations, and some of the key themes and suggestions that came out of that toolkit. And then I'm going to talk about organizational change management, so change at the organizational level, and then change at the individual level. Talking about both our leaders and dealing with individuals in our organizations. And then I have a page of resources for you if you're interested in getting some more resources that can help you be a diversity champion. So moving forward, the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion and human rights work is all about creating change at the societal, organizational, and individual level. It's about changing fundamental aspects of our society and our organizational structures, and it's about changing individuals' understandings and behaviors. There are people in our society and our workplaces who are being subjected to human rights abuses on a daily basis. Ultimate goal is to end that atrocity and ensure that everyone is treated fairly in society and in our workplaces and organizations. To do that, we need to make monumental changes. The data on societal inequalities due to systemic racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, and transphobia is clear, and our goal is to address these inequalities. Many of us are doing this work by addressing the way these systemic inequalities play out within our organizations and workplaces. We have ample data that shows that the processes and systems in many of our organizations were created to favor certain people and certain ways of behaving and certain quote-unquote leadership qualities, and these systems have compounded over time to direct certain people into leadership and create glass ceilings for others at various levels of the organization. If you're interested, actually, by the way, there's a really great report from catalyst.org that talks about this whole idea, which is called Cascading Gender Biases, Compounding Effects. an assessment of talent management systems. Now, since Catalyst focuses on women, it's really about gender, but similar issues are happening around other marginalized groups as well. And what this report is pointing to is the fact that at every stage in our talent management systems, decisions are made that are biased, that affect who can move forward and move up into leadership and who cannot. And that's literally at every stage of every HR decision that happens. So we need to be very much aware of where those biases are occurring and how we mitigate them. Doing this work within organizations helps us to develop services for the public that are better able to meet the needs of our increasingly diverse audience, and that includes the services that we provide as museums, the exhibits that we decide to provide to the public, even down to which artists get space in our museums and which don't. These are all things that we need to really consider to respond to an increasingly diverse audience. As the diversity of the public changes, we need to be able to respond to them, or our cultural institutions will become obsolete, and they'll continue to serve a smaller and smaller segment of society. Something we have to realize is that individual biases, when counted across society and organizations, become systemic. So biases become built into the way that we do things. They become part of our common vernacular. They influence every decision we make and every interaction we have. So in order to make organizational and societal change, we need to get people to recognize and work to mitigate their biases. We all have biases. Literally dozens of biases are operating in your brains right now. We can't get rid of them. They're a part of how our brains work. But we can become aware of them and work to minimize their impact in our decision-making and our interactions with others. We also need to help individuals understand the imperative to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion for our society and for our organizations. There are documented benefits for society and organizations that show that addressing inequalities is good for society, and increasing diversity and inclusion is good for organizational effectiveness. We have to educate people that addressing systemic inequalities is not quote-unquote reverse discrimination. It's simply making things fair. We do not have a meritocracy in Canada. We do not have a level playing field. And some people have disadvantages, and some people have unearned advantages. There's a great analogy that you can use to explain this. So when a sports game is fixed so that one team always wins, requiring that the game be played fairly to give everyone a chance to win is not discrimination against the team for whom it was fixed. It means they now have to compete fairly. Yet people do not give up their privileges easily, especially when they don't recognize that they've had a privilege in the first place, when they believe that we have a meritocracy. And all people have confirmation bias, which also means that they'll reject information that conflicts with what they already believe, and they'll seek out information that confirms what they already believe. So we have a big battle ahead of us. Change is hard. People resist change, and people are inclined not to believe new information presented to them. So we as diversity, equity, and inclusion champions have a difficult job in being change agents. It's neither easy nor smooth, but it's absolutely imperative. And those of us doing this work know how important and essential it is, and that's why we take on this monumental challenge. But since it is so hard, that's why we need supports and approaches that can help us to manage this change. A couple of things we're going to talk about here. First of all, the toolkit. So CCDI's toolkits have been crowdsourced from diversity and inclusion and human resources professionals across the country. What we have done is, over the years, we've hosted events on a particular topic and gained people's insight and brainstorming, and brought together all of their ideas into a toolkit that summarizes all the best ideas from right across the country, usually under a framework that's based on research. So our toolkit, Addressing Fear and Resistance, was developed throughout 2014 with input from over 100 people across the country, and it was released in early 2015. And the toolkit covers 5 steps to overcoming fear and resistance. So we really thank everybody who participated, and we actually have a number of toolkits on our website. They're all free to download. There's a link here at the bottom of this next page. This one covers, at a very, very high level, the 5 steps that we provided to participants and asked them to brainstorm some of the ways that they can do these things. So under each of these major steps, there's a whole bunch of suggestions provided within the presentation and in the actual toolkit itself. So I do recommend that you take a look at the toolkit and download it. There's a link at the bottom of the page there about where you can find that. And we have a number of other toolkits as well. There's a toolkit for developing a diversity business case, a toolkit for developing a diversity strategy, toolkit for employee resource groups, toolkit for rolling out a diversity council. So if there's anything that you're trying to do in your organization, we have free tools to help guide you through that. So some of the high-level points here The first step is to engage all employees in the process of creating a diverse and equitable workplace that provides an opportunity to work and grow. One of the downfalls of many diversity initiatives is they're sometimes created in isolation, and I've even recently heard of an organization in this sector that's doing it in secret. So let me tell you, that's not the best way to do it. So often what happens is there's a small group of people or just one person who creates a diversity strategy, and then there's a big reveal. Okay, that's not necessarily the best way to do it. The other effect of having a one-person diversity team is a lack of accountability by anyone else in the organization. So when all diversity initiatives are driven by just one person or a small team, others in the organization might not see inclusion as their responsibility. And further, this can lead to isolation and burnout of the person or people who have the responsibility for diversity and inclusion. So there's a whole bunch of suggestions in the toolkit around engaging all employees. It is recommended that as soon as you start talking about diversity and inclusion, that there be multiple communications going out to let employees know what you're doing. Even if you're just starting to assess where you're at, just letting people know that something is happening is better than no information at all, right? Okay, so the second step is involving employees in developing the workplace diversity policy or strategy or initiatives. And once that is established, then teams and committees can be formed from employees to ensure that the policies and initiatives are implemented and upheld. There's many ways to involve employees in the development and execution of diversity and inclusion business cases, strategies, policies, initiatives. In fact, we suggest that these initiatives are only going to be successful if they involve as many employees as possible across your organization. Certainly, you can engage employees to gather information about what's actually happening in the organization. That's an important piece of understanding what you need to do. Ultimately, we want all employees to feel that they're involved in diversity and inclusion, and one of the most important ways is to involve them in gathering their information on their experiences, to identify the inclusion issues that need to be addressed. This is what we do at CCDI when we do a current state inclusivity assessment of organizations. We gather information from employees through multiple means, actually providing them with a high degree of confidentiality and security so that they can share the real stories of what's actually been happening in the organization. The third step is to help employees recognize that diversity is a strength and a core competency in our increasingly diverse marketplace. Articulating the imperative or business case for your organization is essential to the success of any endeavor. So we recommend that you take a look at some of our toolkits if you don't already have a business case to help you establish a business case and articulate to the organization why diversity and inclusion and equity is important to your organization. And again, there's lots of suggestions from the participants who contributed to the toolkit here, and some of the brainstorming sessions suggested establishing inclusive behavior as a core competency in your annual performance reviews, articulating what inclusive behavior looks like and how employees can develop this competency. There's a great set of guidelines around inclusive behavior, and one that I'm going to share at the end from Deloitte, which is the 6 traits of inclusive leadership, which are really just traits of inclusive behavior that anyone can implement. Also, articulating why inclusive or culturally competent behaviors improve your ability to serve the public, improve your audience engagement, improve customer service, and improve employee interactions and employee engagement. Articulating the risk of not focusing on diversity and inclusion. That can be, competitive disadvantage. You are competing with people, their time and their money, and where they're going to spend their time and their money potentially in other aspects of the cultural sector or in other entertainment venues. So you want to make sure that you're being responsive to your communities. So there's risk in not doing this. There's a lot of risks to organization: legal risk, reputational risk, low engagement of employees, higher turnover of employees when you're not paying attention to these issues. Drawing on people's emotions is an important piece too, and I'm going to talk about that more in engaging leadership. And providing recognition to diversity champions who support inclusion efforts in your organization is also a great suggestion. Help employees recognize the importance. The fourth step is to teach employees how to use diversity and improve problem-solving, decision-making, innovation, creativity, and ultimately organizational effectiveness by putting an inclusion lens on what you're doing. So diversity training is essential, but it's not necessarily the first step, and we'll talk about that in the change management approach as well. And so it's really important that we think about many different ways of learning and teaching employees, not just formal training. Formal training is important, but it also has to be done thoughtfully. The fifth step is to continue to emphasize the value of diversity management as a their competency in leaders and employees and help employees develop it. It's important that diversity champions in your organization know what the imperative is for your organization and that they are provided with supports to be able to articulate it clearly so that when they encounter resistance or questions, they know what to say. If your champions can't succinctly explain why your organization is doing this, how can you expect your general employee population to understand it? So a theme that was discussed in several groups in the brainstorming sessions was the idea that we all want to live and work in a fair and equitable environment so we can all achieve a sense of personal satisfaction or fulfillment. One approach involved engaging resistors in ensuring that we create and maintain a fair environment. Some suggestions around emphasizing the value included establishing accountability for all employees, but especially senior leaders, establishing it as part of your organizational values, and also ensuring that values are being promoted as things that people should be striving toward, and models of behavior to support. Providing models of behavior to support your organizational values. Many organizations have built diversity, inclusion, or equity right into their organizational values. And they also engaging allies and champions from all demographic groups to support and communicate the inclusion message in as many venues as possible. So again, the toolkit has a lot of specific suggestions to help you do each of these major things. As you'll notice as we go through the change management framework, this aligns very nicely with a lot of the change management strategies. Since we developed this toolkit in 2014, within the 3 years of doing a whole lot of inclusivity assessments and developing diversity strategies for organizations, we've incorporated a more formal change management methodology into our work and deliberately built in change management framework into strategy development process. So we're going to talk about a formal change management methodology known as AddCAR. And there are a number of different ones. I happen to be certified in AddCAR, and I have recently had a number of clients that we've worked with where we've developed diversity strategies for them where they're using AddCAR within their organization. So it's very helpful to utilize the change management approach in the diversity strategy. So we're going to talk now about what exactly is change management. At a very high level, change management is the process, tools, and techniques to manage the people side change to achieve required business results. Now, when we adopt a change management approach to diversity and inclusion, we can use proven techniques that help organizations manage all types of change to implement an approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these can be very helpful in ensuring that the implementation of diversity initiatives is more successful. So when you think about organizational change, it can be represented as three basic states. So you have your current state, which is where you are today. Your transition state was how you're moving from the current to the future, and the future state, how things will be tomorrow. It's really important that we actually understand where we are today, what's the current state. And that's why so many organizations do a current state inclusivity assessment. And one of the major things in understanding this is the demographics of your workforce. And I'm going to plug the museum sector's diversity census because it's really, really important to understand who you've got in your organizations as part of your current state and understanding where you need to go. Before we move on more about change management here, I would like to share sort of what we're hoping our current state will be, right? So this model is called the Deloitte Inclusion Maturity Model. It is a really great, simple way to explain what inclusion is, because you'll have lots of people will say, they have their own definitions of inclusion. Essentially, and we also have people who sometimes say that diversity and inclusion is not about equity and human rights. And it is the baseline of inclusion. So if you look at this model here, it really is showing that fairness and respect, equity and non-discrimination is at the baseline of inclusion. So what's really interesting about Deloitte's research is they've quantified that both diversity and inclusion increases employee engagement. And when you do that, you can then use all the data that quantifies the impacts of employee engagement on customer service, on turnover, on, even in the mining sector, we're looking at the impact on employee engagement on safety incidents. So there's all this great ways of being able to quantify. If you improve diversity and inclusion, you're going to improve employee engagement, and that has all these other organizational effects. what they have found is that when you focus on just diversity, you get a slight improvement in employee engagement. But when you focus on just inclusion, you also get a slight improvement in employee engagement. But when you focus on both, you can actually double the engagement of disengaged employees. This is really great information for articulating the imperative or the business case of why we need to improve our performance on diversity and inclusion. And engaged employees provide better service. They're better able to engage with your audience. They do better work. It's just been proven time and time again. So this formula is actually articulated in the report, which I've listed on the bottom of the screen here, which is called Waiter, Is That Inclusion in My Soup? A New Recipe to Improve Business Performance. It's a fantastic report. So it can't be understated that both diversity, diverse representation, graphics of your workplace, and striving for inclusion are important. So again, going back to this model, how to actually articulate what inclusion is, this model is very helpful. So yes, it is actually intended to look like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because at the most basic level, we need to have fairness and respect. And if you don't have fairness and respect in your workplace, you're not going to move up any further on inclusion. That's the baseline. So from there, you then move up to people feeling value and belonging, that they feel like they are valued in the organization, that they're valued for their individuals that they are, and that they belong in the organization. And once you have achieved that, then you can move up into confidence and inspiration, which is people feel enthusiasm and empowerment, and they feel trust, that the organization trusts them, and they have trust in the organization. So this is a really nice sort of picture to help you describe what inclusion actually is. But at the baseline, if you don't have fairness and respect, if you have discrimination happening, you're not moving up in inclusion. It's really important that we really understand, how do your employees feel about your organization's dedication to diversity and inclusion? How do different demographic groups feel? In our experience, we have a lot of organizations that will do employee engagement surveys but not ask demographic questions. And so then you'll get responses like 60% of your employee base is engaged. Well, that's great, but who's the 40% that's not? And are there certain groups that are overrepresented in that 40%? Are there certain groups that feel less engaged? How do people actually feel based on their own personal experiences, which may differ depending on their personal identities? So it's important that we understand this model, but we actually, at CCDI, in our assessment of organizations, we have 4 questions on our diversity census and inclusion survey that directly relate to this model, and then the rest of the questions can change depending on the organization or sector we're working with. But with understanding how people feel about these main questions is sort of the baseline of understanding people's perceptions of inclusion in the organization. So get a change management. So that's what we're looking for. The future state is getting to high employee engagement and high feelings of confidence and inspiration in the organization. Moving back into change management. So now we know what our future state that we're trying to achieve. We can focus on a change management methodology. So change management initiatives are often focused on the technical side of change, and often they're implemented when you're rolling out a new computer system, right? And then it's about training people to use the new technology. But with every change, there's a people side of the change, and change management methodology focuses on the people side. So that's encouraging people to embrace the change, to learn how to change, and to adapt so that we can actually achieve the desired future state. So moving forward with this a little bit, why do we need to do change management? Why is it so important? There's a great deal of research that's been done, and I'm going to be quoting a lot of research from the organization called ProSci, which actually does AddCAR certification. It's called PROSCI, which kind of stands for Professional Sciences. And so what they have found is that multiple studies and organizational case studies show that when you're using a change management approach, an organization can increase the probability of success that the change will be successfully implemented. When change is not successfully implemented, it has significant costs in lost effort, lost money, employee disengagement, turnover, and sometimes failure of major projects and initiatives that are vitally important to the organization. And the next piece that they find is when you're using change management, you can actually measure the return of investment on efforts towards achieving the change. So good change management methodologies provide templates for measuring how successful the change is and the return on the change success. And the piece is you can actually manage employee resistance to change when you're using a change management methodology. You know, it's a fact of nature. People resist change. We know this. So a formal change management approach helps you to identify where your biggest pockets of resistance may be and to create strategies to mitigate and overcome resistance. And finally, a change management methodology can help build change capacity into the organization, change competency. So for both the people that are managing the change, but also for all of your employees in your organization to be able to better adapt to change and to ensure the outcome that we're hoping for, which in this case is a more diverse and inclusive organization. So those are some of the reasons that have been found about why change management is effective. Now here, there's some data that's been done, research by ProSci. Again, this is looking at a study of more than 2,700 projects that required organizational change. And looked at the effectiveness of the project implementation by the quality of the change management initiatives. So of the 245 research participants who reported having excellent change management effectiveness, 94% of those change projects met or exceeded project objectives. Then of the 1,202 research participants who reported having good change management effectiveness, 76% met or exceeded project objectives. But then you can see what happens, right? For those with fair or poor change management effectiveness, less than half are meeting or exceeding the objectives of their change projects. So actually using a change management approach has a direct impact on the effectiveness of the change. Failing to implement a big change has a tremendous toll on the organization, both in wasted human effort and cost, but also in frustration and disengagement. If you know anything about the Phoenix payroll system of the federal government, this is an example that my instructor used in my change management certification of a major project that did not use effective change management methodology. And the most recent reporting, which was in the CBC and in the fall and also in the Ottawa Citizen, talked about the fact that the cost of the failure is now in excess of $500 million, and the cost keeps going up. So it's really important that we implement change management methodologies when we're implementing change. This next one sort of talks about some of the consequences of not managing the people side of change with a bit of a humorous approach, but really there's documented consequences of not managing change properly for any type of change initiative, and that's lower productivity. You have passive resistance, active resistance, turnover of valued employees, disinterested in the current or the future state, people arguing about the need for change, people potentially having increased absenteeism, changes not being fully implemented, people getting workarounds or simply ignoring the change that we're trying to achieve, people reverting to the old ways of doing things, the change being totally scrapped. Sometimes when you're talking about diversity and inclusion initiatives not being implemented effectively, the damage that can be done in not doing it effectively can actually set the organization back. And one of the things that is common in all change initiatives, but certainly in talking about diversity and inclusion, is these divides between us and them. There's a great question that's come in through the chat feature, and it's how do they measure the effectiveness of change management? I'm going to actually talk about some of the ways that we do that, and in change management methodology, they provide you with a number of templates to do that. So I'm going to address that in a few minutes. Thanks for the question. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the AddCAR model itself and what it stands for and how it works. And I'm going to cover this at a very high level as an introduction for you, but to get you thinking about how we actually do change. And if you're interested in learning more about it, there's tons of information online. If you Google AddCAR, you'll find lots. And I do strongly recommend the certification if you're in any kind of role where you're managing change for your organization. So AddCAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And it's a very simple way to understand what we need to do to make change in an organization. So the first part is helping people build the awareness of the need for the change. Part is building the desire to participate and support the change. And then the knowledge, the K, is knowledge on how to change, and the A is ability the ability to implement the required skills and behaviors to change, and then reinforcement to sustain the change. Reinforcement sometimes is referred to also as resistant management as well. And so we're going to get into a little bit about how you actually do this here. So this AddCAR approach forms the foundation of successful organizational change because it provides a framework for understanding how people change, and we're trying to change each individual or in the organization, which is really challenging. And managers and project teams can use AddCAR to guide the change management plans, to diagnose gaps and resistance, and to develop corrective actions. So we're going to get into a little bit of detail on how this actually works. So preparing for the change needs to happen before the initiatives are rolled out. And so what often happens in many organizations is people develop a project plan, and after they already started rolling out, they go, oh, maybe we need change management. That change management approach should be included at the beginning so that you help to figure how it's all going to be rolled out. So from an D&I perspective, a diversity and inclusion and equity perspective, this is why so many organizations' initiatives feel like scattershot or one-off activities that are not connected, because they haven't thought about the whole picture and what they're trying to achieve and how they're going to roll it out and how it all fits together. So AddCAR can help you guide you through these steps. And it's important to note that identifying sponsors and champions and assessing their readiness and preparing them is a really important part of the initial planning. So AddCAR's methodology contends that every successful change needs a powerful, influential sponsor. And we know very well from diversity and inclusion work that, you know, your leadership behaviors and your leadership's approach to this can make or break whether or not the organization is actually going to move forward. And so this really aligns nicely with the change management approach that you need a strong, powerful, and influential sponsor or leader to lead the change. It's also why you need champions throughout the organization talking about this. So really the major steps of the first phase is defining what your change management strategy is going to be, preparing your change management team, and developing your sponsors and helping them be prepared for what's coming next. Then actually managing the change. This is the phase where you're implementing your diversity and inclusion strategy with a view to increasing employee awareness, desired knowledge, and ability. And so here you're going to develop some change management plans, and these are going to be plans for communications, leadership, coaching, training, and resistance management is taking looking at where you're going to have the biggest resistance or challenges and some special coaching or initiatives to help manage those pockets of resistance. And throughout this, when you're actually certified in this, there's all these different templates that help you do all of this. There's templates on how to assess the readiness of your sponsor and give you a score on how good your sponsor is and what you need to do to get them ready. You can assess your team, and it'll give you a score on how good your team is, and it'll give you advice on what more you need to do to get them ready. So then once you've done all of that work, then you're actually implementing the change and continuing to keep track of how the change is being implemented. Next phase is about reinforcing the change. Reinforcing and sustaining the change is critical. So this means that you need to collect and analyze feedback on how people are feeling about the change, and then using that feedback and other ways of measuring. When you have any kind of project, whatever it is, you have some ways of measuring the success of that project. So if you find that the project is being not implemented appropriately, that will come out in your measures. And so you need to have some good measures here. Selecting and analyzing feedback and looking at those measures can help you diagnose the gaps and manage resistance. It means that you need to be having lots of communications and lots of ways of checking in with people to see how it's actually going in the organization in terms of rolling out diversity and inclusion initiatives, and then implementing corrective actions and celebrating successes. This is a really important piece. Sometimes corrective actions mean that certain people or groups need additional development and coaching. Sometimes corrective action means there has to be consequences. And I'll tell you, working with some organizations right now where it's very clear that there's some harassment happening in the organization. And one organization in particular we're working with, there's some rather egregious harassment happening. Some folks in the organization want to jump right into sending out an email about that there's zero tolerance for harassment in the organization. And we said, look, there actually has to be zero tolerance before you tell the organization that, which means there has to be some consequences for the people that you know who've been harassers. And so there has to be some follow-up, some consequences for people on these kinds of behaviors. Otherwise, your organization, if you start just communicating stuff, saying we don't accept this kind of behavior, but everybody knows that you do, that's actually not good for your employees' trust in the leaders. And employees are highly attuned to BS, right? So when you say something, but we actually know that other things are happening, that's really that's not good for your engagement with your employees and their trust of your organization. Celebrating successes is also important, and so you need to take time to say, hey, we've achieved this. It often seems like a huge uphill battle. Some people I know, compare it to dragging an elephant up a hill doing diversity and inclusion work. It is challenging, but we do need to celebrate when we do have successes, when we have major initiatives that have happened, when we've achieved something big in our diversity and inclusion strategy. It is important that we celebrate those successes and that we celebrate the individuals that are contributing to those successes as well, because it can be daunting work and it can lead to burnout. So making sure that we're letting people know that the efforts that they're putting in are valuable is a really important piece. The next thing is the next slide here is talking about, and this comes from the ProSci research about 2,700 change management projects and how prevalent different approaches in change management were in the projects and effectiveness when they're used. So having a structured approach and methodology, they found that was 80% used in change management initiatives and had an effectiveness of 95%. Focusing on facilitating individual change, not so much prevalence, but very effective when it's used. Measuring the change outcomes, again, not as prevalent, but very effective when used. Create a common language for change in the organization. This is where, when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, ensuring that people actually understand what diversity, equity, and inclusion means, and that people have a common lexicon here. Again, it was not very prevalent, but very effective when used. Integrating change management with project management, not so prevalent, very effective. Empowering your managers. So what we often find in organizations is you'll have who say they support diversity and inclusion. You'll have lots of people in the lower ranks of your organization who are very passionate about diversity and inclusion, but the middle managers are often the people who are being squeezed. They are just overburdened in many organizations, and in many cases they're the area where our diversity and inclusion initiatives fall down if we're not specifically focusing on equipping and empowering them to facilitate change. So here you also see 87% effectiveness if you do that. And I want to point out this last one. Least prevalent, but one of the most effective things you can do, equipping your senior leaders. So in the change management projects they looked at, 2,700 change management projects, 25% of them had actually equipped the senior leaders, but those that did, 97% saw effectiveness in their change management initiative. And that's why the sponsorship part is so important at the phase one of any kind of change management initiative. Understanding the why of AddCAR and what the outcomes are is really important too. So this next slide is a little bit busy. I'm going to break it down a little more easy for you to understand, but different activities that you do relate to outcomes that we're hoping for. So the outcomes are awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. So in the activities that we use in a change management initiative are communications, sponsorship, coaching, resistance management, and training. And so these slides are going to break this down so you can actually see what we're talking about a little more easily here. So this first one talks about what are the impacts of communications. Communications activities are important for building awareness and for reinforcement of the change. So in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, engaging your communications team, if you have one, or whoever's responsible for communications in your organization is essential. And communications also include those coming from sponsors and champions across the organization, which is why it's so important to make sure that your champion or sponsor is equipped and that your senior leaders are equipped. So when organizations are embarking on new diversity initiatives, it's really important to communicate throughout the process. Let me say this again. It's really important to communicate continuously, even if the communication is, we've gathered some information and we're going to share it with you soon. is not good, especially when you've started to embark on these initiatives. So developing things in secret and then doing a big reveal is not the best way to prepare an organization and get buy-in. So letting employees know what's happening, especially if you've done a diversity census and employees have provided feedback, or you've done any kind of initiatives from gathering employee feedback, let them know, okay, the information is being analyzed and we're going to be able to share something with you soon. If you have received feedback from any of these kinds of initiatives, start sharing it with the employees. It's really important that there be constant communication. For us, when we're working with an organization and they're going to do a diversity census for the first time, we actually require them to communicate for 2 to 3 months before they roll it out. So if a company calls us up and says, hey, we need to do a diversity census next month, we say, no, you're not ready. You need to communicate a long time before you do this. And the reason for this is because in the past, we have rushed it for employers who wanted to roll it out more quickly and get it done. One employer refused to follow any of our guidelines on communication or advice, and they had the worst response rate ever that we've ever had in all of our 70 censuses that we've conducted. So really, really important, the communications piece, and it has to be constant, ongoing throughout. Now, this piece is about sponsorship, and it talks about how important preparing, equipping, and creating a sponsorship roadmap is, and because it has multiple effects. It helps with awareness building. It helps people build the desire to support the change. So this is really important. When your senior leader is saying something is important to the organization, most people in the organization get behind it, even if they're not personally completely supportive, because they know it's important to the organization and the senior leaders. I've seen this play out in multiple organizations. If the senior leader is not talking about it, the organization is not going to put as much importance behind it. So senior sponsors and champions help with ongoing building the awareness, building the desire, and also the ongoing reinforcement of the change. In assessing your sponsor, it's really important that the sponsor be someone with authority and influence in the organization, but also someone who has demonstrated a commitment to diversity and inclusion. So if they're lacking on that last point, the additional coaching and preparation. Having a sponsor who does not walk the talk can have serious impacts for the effectiveness of the rollout of diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization. And it also has serious impacts to your employees' perceptions of the organization's actual commitment. Again, it goes back to that employee trust. When the leaders say one thing and do something else, employees don't trust your leaders. So if the leaders are saying, hey, diversity and inclusion is really important, but they're not demonstrating that in their day-to-day behaviors, again, employees are highly attuned to BS, and that impacts the view of the organization, their engagement in the organization, and their trust in their leaders. Really, really important that the leaders and the sponsors be prepared and know what they need to do here. So, coaching. Here you see how important coaching is. It really leads to every single outcome that we're trying to achieve here. So coaching comes in many forms, and it has impact throughout the entire change management process for all the outcomes we're trying to achieve. It is intending that coaching comes from sponsors and champions to others throughout the organization, so that's why it's so important to equip your sponsors and champions for success. I need to educate sponsors and champions, to provide them with training, to provide them with information, with talking points, with the business case, with the imperative, so that they can be effective ambassadors for diversity and inclusion throughout the organization. This is one of the reasons why so many organizations develop diversity councils and committees and networks throughout the organization. These are champions who are working throughout the organization to educate others. So if you want support on that, if you're interested in implementing a diversity council, we have recently released a toolkit on diversity councils and committees, which kind of guides you through if you have an executive-led diversity council, if you have regional or departmental diversity councils, and how you set them up for success and what kinds of structures you might put around guiding them. The next piece, resistance management, is all about creating desire. So it's about looking at where people are not supporting or not for the change. This could be certain departments or divisions or individuals. Addressing resistance means building the desire for resistors to support the change. And resistance management can involve many activities. For diversity and inclusion, it may mean providing additional communications and coaching about the imperative for the organization. Sometimes it's training. Sometimes it's as basic as reinforcing people's legal responsibility or reinforcing the code of conduct that you have in your organization. We have a legal responsibility to provide a respectful workplace, free of harassment and discrimination to our colleagues. So helping resistors understand the legal imperatives and the organizational and personal risk associated with not providing the basic level of fairness and respect is important for people to understand. Sometimes resistant management, again, comes in the form of punitive actions against those who violate codes of conduct or respectful workplace policies. People need to know that there are consequences, and that is sometimes what resistance management involves. Moving on to the last piece is training. You see this as deliberately in the change management approach. It's not the first thing that you jump to. And it's about building knowledge and ability. So really, communications and sponsorship, coaching are all vitally important. And a lot of organizations, when they start on diversity and inclusion, they go, we need to train our people. Training is important. Yes, building people's knowledge and ability to do things is important. But it's one tool in the toolkit, and it needs to be done thoughtfully and as part of a wider strategy for building an inclusive workplace. So sometimes training builds awareness as well, but essentially we're trying to equip people with how they become more inclusive in their day-to-day behaviors. Okay, you see the outcomes that it has here. It is important, but it's a piece of the puzzle, and has to be done really in a thoughtful and effective way, along with these other pieces. If you're interested in training, we at CCDI have extensive curricula, which includes e-learning and instructor-led training, beginning from diversity fundamentals or diversity 101, unconscious bias, mitigating bias in talent management, and a number of different branching areas that you can go into from fundamentals, including cross-cultural competence and a number of other different areas. So all about helping people build the knowledge and ability to be more effective in diversity, equity, and inclusion and be more culturally competent. But it's important that one training course is not going to change people. It's part of a journey, and that training is one tool in the toolbox for change management. So that's, if I can just do a quick recap on what we learned about organizational change management, and then I'm going to talk about change at the individual level. So change management focuses on the people side of organizational change, and you have to really change each individual in the organization. It involves both individual and organizational perspectives. It requires action and involvement by leaders and managers throughout the organization. And change management and project management are both tools that support project benefit realization, which is meaning that the project is successfully implemented. So the project management is the technical side, and the change management is the people side, getting that change effectively implemented. Change management is most effective when it is launched at the beginning of a change initiative and integrated into the entire strategy or all of the activities throughout the journey. Next, we're going to talk about change at the individual level. And the first thing we want to talk about is why it's so important to equip leaders. So this, again, goes right back to the change management idea about equipping your leaders and sponsors. The impact of leadership commitment to diversity and inclusion cannot be overstated, and we have seen this play out in so many organizations. The leaders' behaviors create the organizational culture. Every organization that we work with has their stated values. Whether people actually live those values day to day, the act is more telling whether they actually do. So many organizations we look at, they're not living the stated values day to day. What the organizational culture is about who gets punished and who gets rewarded and for what behaviors, who gets hired and who gets fired, and the leadership behaviors create that climate. It's one of the most important pieces of the organizational culture. So we really need to understand the importance of leaders' behavior in organizational culture. Leaders' behaviors impact employee engagement. There's a great deal of research that backs this up. And in our studies, we actually look at how people's perspectives are on the leaders' commitment to diversity and inclusion, as well as people's perspectives on organizational culture. The leadership individuals, their behaviors, their understanding, and their developmental level or their level of cultural competence will dictate the focus on diversity, equity, inclusion in the organization, and that will mean that it will also dictate how much resources get dedicated toward diversity and inclusion. If the leaders don't think it's important, why would they give money and resources to it? So it's really important that they understand how important it is, and we actually develop them so that they can better support these types of initiatives and understand that it's important for their organizations. All leadership behaviors and their understanding and their developmental level will impact the employee perceptions of the inclusivity of the organization. And again, that goes back to when leaders are not walking the talk. If they say diversity is important, but in their day-to-day behavior they don't demonstrate that really impacts employees' perceptions of how really the organization is dedicated to diversity and inclusion. And so it's important that we recognize how important leaders are. So going back again to this inclusion maturity model, I want to point out that Deloitte has also done research on inclusive leadership, and all of that research is about making sure that the leaders in the organizations directly impact all of these aspects of inclusion. They actually tie leadership behaviors to developing fairness and respect, value and belonging, confidence and inspiration. And there's actually a really great report that Deloitte has called the 6 Signature Traits of Inclusive Leadership, if you want to delve into that more. I have a list of resources at the end of this presentation, so you don't have to frantically write these things down. But again, leaders' behavior directly impacts the inclusion organization. Equipping leaders, how do we do that? Are we talking about their hearts or their brains? So actually it's both, and so there's a lot of debate in this realm about, are we trying to change people's minds, are we trying to change people's hearts? In fact, it is important that we change both. So if you're looking at the heart, you get the arguments that it's the right thing to do. You appeal to leaders' desires to be effective leaders. You help them understand the personal impacts of feeling exclusion to the employees and to those that they're trying to serve, your audiences. You understand if abuse, harassment, and discrimination are happening under their watch. Do they want to be responsible for that? Ask them if they want to deal with a PR crisis. Shame and fear can be powerful motivators for people. So understanding that there's both benefits to be gained and risks to not dealing with this. And do they want to be the leader at the helm when the PR crisis hits the media? We've seen what happened last year with the Me Too campaign and all of the leaders of organizations where harassment and discrimination is happening that have had to step in as a result of these things. When we're talking about the brain, this is really about helping them understand the imperative or the business case, or however is the best way to talk about it in your organization. Help them understand the organizational impacts of improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. Help them understand that this will help them better serve the audience. This will help them diversify their audience. This will help them ensure the long-term sustainability of your organization. Help them understand the bottom line impacts. Help them understand the reputational risks and the legal risk, both from an organizational liability perspective, but also from a personal liability perspective when harassment and discrimination are happening. It's really important that they understand both from an emotional perspective why this is important, but also from a logical perspective why this is important. And so there's lots of things that we can do to support them, and I have some resources at the end, but really giving them information about the imperative, about the business case, about ways of talking about this is important to help you move the organization forward, to help get the resources that you need for them to really pay attention to these things. So next we're going to talk about how to respond to inappropriate behavior. And I get into this and say, first of all, when people, this is a personal choice you have to make when you're faced with these kind of situations, okay? And there's multiple different ways to approach it, some which we have seen to be more effective and some which we have seen to be less effective, but it's a personal choice every time, okay? So if you know that there's a particular person who's expressed inappropriate comments in the workplace, there's several avenues that you may consider in responding to them. The first is to address their behavior directly. On the next few slides, we're going to provide some suggestions that were crowdsourced on how to respond to inappropriate comments. Okay, you may not agree with all of them. You be comfortable with trying all of them. And the important thing is to note different ways of trying to respond to the behavior directly. Okay. So if you feel it's too risky to address the situation directly, especially if the person is higher in the hierarchy than you, has more power than you, again, this is a decision we all have to make. In this case, we can enlist the help of others in addressing the situation. So one option is to report them to human resources. You could cite your organization's respectful workplace policy or code of conduct, or just the applicable human rights codes around harassment and discriminatory behavior in the workplace. The organization has a responsibility to ensure that harassment and discriminatory behavior are not happening. And in Ontario, it's long been part of the law that includes behaviors coming from employees, fellow colleagues, as well as customers and vendors. But actually, the Canadian Supreme Court in December made a decision that actually applies that rule right across Canada. That the definition of harassment across Canada has been expanded to include not just so-called harassment and discrimination coming from employers, but also from your colleagues, your coworkers, your vendors, and your clients. Somebody that you must interact with in the workplace. So your organization is responsible to ensure that that's not happening, and there's legal risk if you're not doing that. And in fact, individuals can be named in Human Rights Tribunal rulings as personally liable, as well as the organizational being liable. So that's important for human resources folks and for your organizational leadership to know. Another way that you might approach this is to ask a sponsor or a champion or somebody who's higher in the hierarchy as well to speak to the person about their behavior, the way it's being interpreted by others, and its impact on others. But you do need to equip the sponsor or champion with information to support this kind of a discussion. In case, the people who make inappropriate comments can be reminded that no matter what they believe outside work, they have a legal obligation to provide a work environment for their colleagues that's free of harassment and discrimination. So we need to address the impact of their behavior at work. It's not a violation of their freedom of speech at work. Freedom of speech means that the government cannot arrest you for what you say. It does not mean that you are free from the consequences of what you say. And also, we have codes of conduct and we have human rights codes that dictate what is appropriate behavior in the workplace. So if someone has sexist or racist or homophobic or transphobic beliefs, it's not okay to express those in the workplace. It's a violation of other people's rights. And it's not a violation of the individual's rights to keep that quiet in the workplace. That's not about freedom of speech. That's about appropriate code of conduct in your organization. Everyone deserves to be able to come to work and have a workplace that is free from harassment and discrimination. So these are important things to note when you do experience resistance from people. When you call them out on a comment and they say, I have the right to say this, they don't have the right to say it at work. So that's a good thing to think about, have in your back pocket when you do encounter resistance. So if you decide to respond individually in the moment, these are suggestions. They are just that. They're suggestions, okay? They were crowdsourced by an organization called Creative Spirits, which is an organization that provides information and education on Aboriginal culture and anti-racism in Australia, but their toolkits and their resources have been distributed quite widely, and many of them are very, very useful. Again, your decision on how to react in the moment will be dependent on many factors, but knowing a number of ways to respond may help you to choose one and actually respond in the moment. The first suggestion is that you react calmly. It's really important to be calm in these kind of things. A lot of times it's perfectly reasonable and natural to become upset by some of the things that people say. But when we get angry, we actually are less effective in communicating. So in terms of reacting calmly, conveying disapproval or discomfort about what they have said, questioning their use of certain words or actions. Sometimes it's important to gauge their intent. Why did you say that? What do you mean by that? Sometimes even just asking people to explain their meaning behind a comment will cause them to rethink the comment when they realize how it could be interpreted. Conveying your feelings, letting them know that the comment or joke makes you feel uncomfortable, letting them know that it's problematic or inappropriate. If they fear, again, questioning their fear, asking them why they might be fearful. Again, please, you really need to try not to get triggered yourself. People want to push your button to get you angry often. Sometimes that's what they're trying to do. Again, it's important that you don't follow your initial emotional response and get triggered to get angry. It's absolutely natural to get angry when we hear offensive comments, especially when they're directed at you personally. But we need to ask ourselves, what's our end game? Will playing your anger help the situation? In martial arts, it's believed that one's anger is a weapon only to your opponent. People use their anger against you. So keeping yourself calm is really important. Consider the people that you're talking to as learners. Remember that they might be less enlightened and less tolerant than you are, and they might not even know that their comment or action is inappropriate or problematic, and they need to be educated. And expect ignorance. Unfortunately, a lot of people convince themselves that they're not the racist or sexist or homophobic, but they need to understand that some of the statements that they're making are interpreted in a way that they don't necessarily expect. This phase on how to respond is reacting toward the issue or thing that they said, not the person. Okay, there's a really great video. I'm not going to try and show the video because that often is very clunky on a webinar platform, but I've listed it down here. It's called "How to Tell Someone They Sound Racist." Okay, so what it says is address what they said or did and avoid calling the person racist. Okay, and as you call them racist, you actually are limiting your own ability to make your point, okay? So you have to point that what they said is problematic or breaks social norms or what's considered to be acceptable or breaks code of conduct in your organization or breaks human rights codes. But if you actually say you're racist, then you're going to diminish your own argument, okay? Very important to recognize that. This video is really great, goes step by step in telling you why not to call someone racist, but to point out but what they said might be racist. And this goes for sexist and homophobic and transphobic and ableist and all the other isms that people can say. It's about addressing the thing that the person said and not labeling the person, and that's an important distinction there. Okay. So some way that you can actually address this is say, here's what you said is problematic because, and help them understand the impact. What you said might be interpreted in this way, and you might not be aware, and that might not be your intent, okay? So, again, the video is a great video. It's only a 3-minute video. Take a moment to look at it when you have a moment here. So the last thing I want to give is a message for HR folks and leaders of organizations, okay? So in the work that I do, I hear a lot of stories about how human resources departments and managers deal with these types of issues appropriately. When a person comes to you with, and I'm going to be a little bit harsh here, okay? When a person comes to you with a complaint of harassment or discrimination, if you're in HR or if you're in management, that's the defining moment how they're going to view your organization's commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity, okay? And keep in mind, I'm not just trying to diss human resources people. I've personally worked in human resources for over 20 years, okay? But in the work that we do, we hear repeatedly about organizations, HR departments, and managers not dealing with these complaints seriously. So if someone comes to you to talk about their experiences of harassment and discrimination, keep in mind that this is not usually a one-off. It's usually when the person's been dealing it for a while that they finally decide to report it, okay? And usually if someone's coming forward to report it, there's dozens of other people experiencing the same thing. So it's really important that we treat the complaint seriously. We treat the complainant with respect. Thank them for bringing it forward, and we investigate thoroughly. And if that means that you have to bring in a third-party investigator, then you got to do that, okay? Because often if the investigation is done by somebody in the organization and the investigation shows that there wasn't harassment or discrimination, it may be very hard for the employee to accept that. And that also you have to take appropriate action to address whatever it is. And under human rights codes in Canada, it's the responsibility of the employer to provide an environment that's safe and free from harassment and discrimination. And honestly, some of the things that we've heard from HR professionals that HR people have said to employees reporting harassment and discrimination, it's really disturbing. Often we hear that, you go and report something and nothing happens, or there's reprisals against the complainant, which is both socially in the organization and with regard to career opportunities, and that is illegal under all human rights codes. Sometimes we've heard the complainant gets fired, or the complainant and the perpetrator are moved into different positions, so they don't have to work together anymore. Well, what happens there? There's no consequences for the perpetrator, and that person gets to go on and discriminate against someone else. Or the perpetrator is promoted, so that the complainant doesn't have to work with them anymore. And not only are there no consequences there, but then the perpetrator gets rewarded. Sometimes the complainant is paid off and there are no consequences for the perpetrator. Or the HR person tells the complainant any number of completely inappropriate things, like, these are actual things that we've heard, honestly. Well, that's your opinion. Or you're being too sensitive. Or boys will be boys. Or you were wearing a short skirt. What did you expect? Or you should just learn to laugh it off. Or many other ways of gaslighting the complainant, diminishing and dismissing the complainant's concerns, and excusing and allowing the behavior to continue. We've actually heard these things. These are no exaggeration. My last point, this is for everybody in organizations, but especially leaders and HR people, is when you permit, you promote. When there's inappropriate behavior happening in your organization, if you want to continue, the message to everybody is that's okay. This is my mantra in the work that I'm doing. What you permit, you promote. So if inappropriate behavior is not checked, you basically are sending the message that that is okay. So it's really important that we all understand what needs to happen and how we approach these things. And if you want more resources on this, we have lots and lots and lots of resources to share with you. And with that, here's a few resources. And I know that Rhiannon's going to share this on the website after. I could just describe a few of these. I'm running out of time, I know. Thank you, Rhiannon. So the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks is the best overview of the entire realm of diversity and inclusion management in organizations, free to download. If you just Google download GDIB, you'll find it, but there's a link here for you. The City of Ottawa Equity and Inclusion Lens Handbook is also a great tool for teaching people about equity and inclusion, but it is a tool that you can apply regardless of the size of your organization to anything that you do, communications, policy and program development, services development, anything that you're doing, and it gives you a list of questions to answer that you can put an equity and inclusion lens on everything that you're doing. Change Together, a diversity guidebook for startups and scale-ups is specifically designed for small organizations. Where is that inclusion in my soup? I've referred to that repeatedly. That's where we have the Deloitte Inclusion Maturity Model. The 6 Signature Traits of Inclusive Leadership from Deloitte, again, provides a great model of traits and behaviors that exemplify inclusive leaders and their impacts in the organization. And one that we've just come across recently, which we're now incorporating into a lot of our work, is the role of authentic leadership in fostering workplace inclusion. And this is a really great study that discusses how leadership behaviors create the climate for inclusion. And then finally, I've given a link again to CCDI's reports and toolkits, which are all free to download. So all of this stuff you can access for free. Do recommend that you take advantage of as much of the free resources as you possibly can. And with that, I'm going to open up for questions and hand it back over to Rhiannon to manage the question and answer period.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much, Cathy. So we have some time for questions. So there is the chat box there if people want to send their questions. I noticed we have 2 people joining by teleconference who may not have the opportunity to use the chat box. So I'm also going to unmute these 2, or this one caller, so if they have any questions, they can let us know. Any questions that people would like to have Cathy address?
Well, if you just go back to the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks for a moment. One of the reasons why I always recommend this, and we actually use it as required reading for new employees at the CCDI, it is the most comprehensive, holistic overview of how an organization can be managing diversity and inclusion. It has 14 categories of benchmarks with 5 levels in each category. And what's really interesting about it is those 14 categories, only 4 of them are what they call internal categories, so the HR functions. So it really helps you understand that it's about everything that your organization is doing, the public, your relationships with the community, with the government, your suppliers, your products and service development delivery, as well as the way you manage your employees. It is a fantastic overview. It's like an 80-page document, but it also helps you to understand where your organization is at on the 5 levels and can help you set a goal to move up 1 level, and which is really great because what often happens is when people learn about diversity and inclusion, they might learn about a best practice, and they go, we should implement that best practice here. Well, if you're really early on your journey, that might not be the best practice for you, and it might have taken an organization 30 years to get to the best practice level. So GDIB helps you really understand where you are now and helps you understand where you could go next, rather than jumping up 5 levels on your approach to on your journey of diversity and inclusion.
Oh, I don't think we have questions just yet. If there's no questions, I'm going to pass it over to Sonia to just sort of take us out. So just 1 second. Are you?
All right. Well, you know what? It was funny because I'm not always like the best technology person, and someone in our group here wanted to ask a question. So before I do our closing, Chris, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I just wondered whether you found in your studies whether trade unionized workplaces tend to have better infrastructure for dealing with inclusivity and diversity, and that it's easier to work with them.
Thank you for the question. And so we've had a lot of experience with organizations that have trade unions, and I can't give a definitive yes or no. I will say it depends. It depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the particular unions, and some unions have a very strong approach to equity and human rights and social justice. It also depends on the relationship between the unions and the employers. And in some cases, it depends how many unions the employer is dealing with. I did a diversity strategy recently for an employer that has 37 bargaining units. So it's a little bit challenging to say that all the unionized employees have a particular view, right? And so in that case, you're dealing with 37 union leaders in the organization, and that particular organization has a lot of different types of roles with different unions supporting different people. So it really depends on the relationship between the organization and the union and how open the communication is. I will say that what we have seen repeatedly is getting the union leadership on board with diversity and inclusion, which means involving them very, very early in the process, is vitally important. And that it goes back to a whole lots of employees and communications, right? And so if you develop a diversity strategy and don't involve the union folks in developing that strategy, you may have difficulty in rolling it out. And especially, when we're doing a diversity census in unionized environments, again, getting the union leadership to support that will help get the membership to support that. So involving your union leaders very, very early is super important. But again, there's no definitive yes, it works better, or no, it doesn't work better in unionized environments. There's a lot of dependencies there. I hope that helps.
So that answer the question?
I think so. It does. Chris
Okay.
is nodding his head, so yes.
Okay, thank you.
Cathy, I always really, really enjoy hearing you speak. And it's funny because I've had a little bit of training in AddCAR now, and I've used it on some larger museum projects. And the analogy I can make for our other museum community out here is that AddCAR is like preventative conservation. It's a way of almost ensuring that your project will be successful and that change to happen. So, if we look for the bugs and we do our dusting and we make sure that our light levels are good, it's the same idea with AddCAR. So if anyone gets a chance, I would really, really recommend that they do some training in it because it is such a useful tool. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Cathy, for sharing with us today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our project partners, the Royal Ontario Museum and the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, as well as the Ontario Ministry of Citizen and Immigration for their support of this webinar. I hope today's presentation has presented an opportunity to reflect on and consider how each of us can support equity and inclusion within our institutions no matter what level or stage we're at. Thank you to everyone who signed in today for your participation. When you leave the webinar, you will be directed to a short evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to let us know how we did today. And in closing, please mark your calendars for the Inclusive Museum Leadership Symposium on March 23rd, 2018 at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto as we launch our Inclusive Museum Guide to the good work of our partner museums and the Advisory Committee. This event will create a platform for critical dialogue on the ways we understand, talk about, and enact equity and inclusion in museums, galleries, and cultural artistic spaces, and build community around issues of inclusion and social justice in Ontario museums. Registration and speaker information is available on the website. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I appreciate it, and thank you so much for everybody who joined us today, and we will be sharing out the recording in sort of the next week or two.